Over the past 6 months, the US economy has changed in more ways than one. The stock market crashed, crypto collapsed, and Google searches for recession are at an all-time high. All the signs are pointing to a painful downturn ahead, but there's still a massive debate unfolding about whether or not we are actually in a recession. So what's really going on?
There's one gap in the polling data that's bigger than we've ever seen before.
They're getting raises because of the inflation, but the amount that they're getting raised is less than the inflation.
We're entering a recession unseen like any other, where the bottom half are going to get devastated.
Goes into a recession.
We're in a recession. Real recession.
In order to get to the bottom of this, I called up a prominent financial analyst and content creator named Kyla Scanlon. But before we talk to her, it's important to level set a bit. People think a recession is defined as 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, but that's not the only widely used definition. The US government relies on the National Bureau of Economic Research to identify recessions using a variety of economic indicators. They look at industrial production, employment, incomes, and trade to get a bigger picture view of how the economy is doing. And recessions can occur extremely quickly, like in February of 2020, when we did have a recession, but it was extremely short.
We're in a recession, and it's not the time to increase taxes or spending.
The argument over whether or not we should call this a recession has already become politicized. The current political administration will always want to paint as rosy a picture of the economy as possible. But this isn't just because politicians tend not to get reelected during recessions. Promoting optimism about the economy can actually lead to more economic growth, but we'll get to that phenomenon later on. Right now, it's more important to understand how bad this economic decline is, regardless of what we call it. GDP is falling, and that's never good. In fact, if we look back through history, we can identify 10 different occasions where GDP declined for 2 or more consecutive quarters. And here's the interesting thing. When you look at those 10 periods, dating all the way back to 1949, every single time GDP dropped for 2 consecutive quarters, it was eventually declared a recession. So even if we don't use the 2 declining quarters metric as our definition, it's clearly a very strong indicator that a recession is on the horizon. But all this talk of are we or aren't we in a recession completely misses the point, in my opinion. The bigger question is, how bad is this compared to previous recessions? In order to answer that question, I pulled the GDP numbers for the past 80 years of recessions to quantify exactly what's going on, and what I found was really interesting. It's down 0.6% to be precise. That's actually the smallest decline going into a recession since 1947. The vast majority of recessions start with a 1, 2, or even 3% decline in the first 6 months, but we're doing a lot better right now. This could all change in the future, but right now, if we are in a recession, it looks pretty mild. But it's not just the GDP numbers that make today's economic decline look different from past recessions. It's also important to look at the employment numbers. See, when you look at historical recessions, you always see 2 things. GDP goes down and unemployment goes up. What's weird about the present-day situation is that unemployment is actually down. A lot of this stems from the fact that unemployment was so high during the pandemic that the job market is still in rebound. But overall, it's still a good sign. So clearly we're in a weird situation. But perhaps more importantly, what can we do to stop economic decline and pump up growth? Well, by now we all know that inflation is the name of the game this year. Prices are going up at gas stations, supermarkets, and more, so consumers are clearly feeling that things are getting rough. We're also starting to see layoffs at a lot of big companies, and there's a general feeling of anxiety in the air about what comes next. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate to try and maximize employment while ensuring price stability. And now that inflation is spiking, the Fed has to step in and try and stabilize prices without destabilizing the overall economy. So they've been raising interest rates and reducing the money supply to try and tame inflation. But will it work? Well, the head of the Fed, Jerome Powell, has already cautioned that it will be challenging to tame inflation without triggering a recession, so it might be inevitable. There is one way to pull out of this before it's too late, though. And in order to understand how to stave off recessions, we need to go deeper into what causes them. Speculative bubbles, global conflicts, worldwide pandemics, these are all common causes of recessions. But there is one common element between each one. They erode consumer confidence dramatically. In 1936, the economist John Maynard Keynes used the term animal spirits to describe a collection of instincts and emotions that guide human behavior. The idea is that a large portion of positive human activity is the result of spontaneous optimism rather than some mathematical expectation. As these animal spirits rise, humans experience a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction. This optimism results in hard work, risk-taking, investment, and many more activities that set the stage for economic growth. When everyone is optimistic about the future, we collectively work to make that imagined future a reality. But unfortunately, this also works in the opposite direction as well. When everyone expects that a collapse is inevitable, they pull back on everything. Consumers buy less goods and services, factories reduce production capacity, companies lay off workers, and everything slows down. Animal spirits can feed off themselves and create frenzies, so the government typically tries to step in during moments of crisis and set the stage. The goal is to allow the creativity of capitalism to flourish, but also curtail excesses that occur because of our animal spirits. Confidence isn't strictly limited to expectations about the economy, though. It goes deeper. Animal spirits refers also to the sense of trust humans have in each other. If there's a sense of fairness in economic dealings, everyone is more likely to collaborate effectively. During difficult economic times, it's critical that people understand how our collective emotions affect the economy. Financial analyst Kyla Scanlon has done a fantastic job of popularizing this idea with a new twist. She recently argued that we are currently in a vibe session, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. The unemployment data might still be strong, and it's possible that the Fed tames inflation without causing a recession, but clearly the vibes are totally off right now. There are so many different economic problems to grapple with, but there's also a big disconnect between the reality of what's going on and the current vibes. I wanted to go deeper into all of this, so I called up Kyla to help sort this out. I wanted to talk to you specifically about the vibe session piece you put together. So could you just give me kind of your overview of what your thesis was with that piece, and maybe if anything's changed since then, what your feeling on it is currently?
Yeah. So that piece was basically like, we're not in a recession according to the economic data, but it sure feels like we're in one. And that was the whole point of like a vibe session, like the vibes are off, right? And so like we have a recession in vibes. So that was the whole point of the piece, just talking about like, jobs are relatively okay. Of course, inflation is raging, but everything else is doing decent. Things are not horrible, but it doesn't feel good, right? And like, especially if you say that out loud to people who are struggling with inflation and struggling to afford groceries, rent, etc., it can be, it's like yelling at somebody in a hole that, at least you haven't hit the bottom of the hole yet. So that's part of the problem. But yeah, that was the whole thesis of the piece. And I do think that the economic data has worsened since I wrote that. So I wrote it very recently, like a month ago, maybe. Yeah. But I do think like now we're starting to see a downturn in the metrics. We have a print in the GDP next week, which will tell us if we're in a technical recession or not a recession, but just technical. So yeah, lots of interesting things coming. And
the definition for technical recession is 2 quarters? Still?
Yeah. So 2 quarters of declining GDP growth. Okay. A lot of people think that's like the actual definition of recession, which is not. And BER is the group that actually decides if we're in a recession, and they look at more than just GDP, right? So a lot of this comes back to, if there is a recession, I think a lot of people will lay it at the hands of the Fed. So can you talk a little bit about how you view what the Fed is working on, kind of their dual mandate, and like why they're doing the things that they're doing, I guess? Yeah. So their dual mandate is price stability and maximum employment, which are very hard to achieve, right? Like, how do you achieve both of those things at the same time? And so I think like this is an unpopular opinion, and I get yelled at all the time for it, but like I think they're doing the best that they can, and the best that they can is not good. So I think that's an important point to make. Like the best that they can do right now is not good. So I think they're trying their best. Like they're going to probably raise rates. They have another meeting next week, and they're probably going to reduce rates by 75 basis points. But the question is like, is them doing this sort of monetary policy going to be enough, right, to sort of stem the inflation that we're seeing, which is largely coming from energy prices, and raising rates is not going to pump more oil out of the ground. It doesn't really work like that. So I think the Fed is doing the best that they can with the tools that they have, but we really need to see like fiscal policy, like the government step in and do something. But they're gridlocked. So
I heard an interesting interview with someone who worked at the Fed, and they said that one of the problems, like you saw this when the recession warning started happening on Twitter, a lot of people were kind of inflation hawks, like 9 months ago or a year ago and saying like, we're seeing inflation, like why isn't the Fed doing anything? Why isn't the Fed doing anything? There's this theory at the Fed that you shouldn't step on the gas and the brake at the same time. And in general, if you're expanding the balance sheet, you shouldn't really be raising interest rates at the same time, right? So the thought was, well, forward guidance is a very powerful tool in the toolkit for the Fed. And they'd given this forward guidance about balance sheet activity. So they couldn't really act any sooner because that would invalidate their previous forward guidance, and they have to maintain some level of credibility. There's this interesting element where the Fed seems to act a little bit slower than some people might like, but the alternative might actually be worse, which is, I think, a little bit of what you're highlighting. I just wanted to know if you'd thought about that, like stepping on the gas and the brake, like that being because I think that's happening in the EU right now. There's a little bit of like, they're still expanding the balance sheet while raising interest rates, and it sends a very confusing signal to the market. Whereas in the US, the money supply is actually decreasing right now and interest rates are rising, which is a very logical action for the Fed to take. But I just wanted to know if you had thought anything about like the role of forward guidance in what the Fed is doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a couple of like, to the point of like, why did the Fed not address inflation? The forward guidance was a big part of that, but also they did not have leadership clarity. Like Jerome Powell did not know if he was going to be in charge of the Fed. And so like that prevented them from moving. As Randy Quarles, who was on the Fed, actually spoke about that a few months ago. And basically, like he was like, yeah, we didn't know who was going to be in charge. Like it's really hard to make policy if you don't know who's going to be in charge. Because like the different people would handle it different ways. So I think that's an important point. And then in terms of like credibility and forward guidance, like, yeah, that the reason that the Federal Reserve members come out and speak so much is because they're trying to maintain that credibility, trying to make sure that people are like, okay, yes, we do believe that the Fed is saying these things, and that even if they don't do these things, like it's still going to make that impact on the market. And the Fed also moved really slow because like there was uncertainty around the labor market to the point of forward guidance. Like they were like, we really need to make sure that maximum employment is still going to be like an important part of what we're doing. And so that just really compounded into them moving slow. And now it's really this, how do they maintain credibility? And that involves them speaking out so much and just sticking to what they have.
So in terms of the pandemic, what do you think was like, how do you think the inflation like actually played out there? And was there anything that the government could have done sooner to kind of avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, with the pandemic, it's really like what could we have done before that happened to, number one, prevent a pandemic from happening. Two, like the supply chains and like having just in time. It became really apparent that is a very fragile system. And if you don't have like the labor needed, or if you don't have the boats going at the same, like the time that they need to be going, all of a sudden everything begins to break down. So I think supply chains and the breakdown that came from that because of the pandemic are just a huge driver of inflation. And I think it's actually underappreciated, even though we talk about it a lot. I think it's very important because like we got really used to like the Amazon effect where we could order whatever. And so like there is the numerical aspect of that inflation, but then also the qualitative aspects, or qualitative. So the qualitative is like, oh, I can't get things as fast as I used to. There's shortages. And that, to the point about consumer sentiment, expectations that we were talking about earlier, that sort of compounds the inflationary feeling even more. Yeah,
it's interesting. Like I wonder what would have happened if they'd raised rates earlier. I mean, it seems like it would have just hurt GDP much more and kind of limited the recovery.
There's been a lot of really good articles recently about capital investment and the lack thereof that we've had in the United States. So like companies are preferring to buy back shares versus invest in the infrastructure, right? And same with the United States, like the government, like there's not a whole lot of investment, even though we have infrastructure bill. So I think like that's part of the problem, is that we just have underinvested in these very important things like supply chain. So it's not a question of can the Fed raise rates and fix this? It's like, how can we make it better, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't really help if you raise rates and then companies buy back shares or something. And then what was your view on the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I mean, that caused an energy crisis in Europe, right? And also a food shortage. It's really created a lot of issues. So like Russia is a huge energy supplier to Europe. And if you invade your neighbor, all of a sudden like that energy is not going to be as stable as it was. And you don't want to use that energy as much, sanctions, etc. So I think like that has been really inflationary, especially in Europe. And then for food, like if you look at emerging market nations, a lot of countries were reliant on Ukraine for wheat. and Russia for wheat, and that's just not been as stable. So like there's all these dominoes that are sort of tipping because of that war. And then supply chains, right? Like the boats not being able to exit Ukraine. Ukraine is, I think, like the 5th largest producer of wheat, and that goes everywhere. So it's really impactful.
I think we've seen energy prices kind of tick down recently. Is that correct?
Yeah. Recently.
So what do you attribute that to?
So oil's kind of funky, right? So like oil's gone down a little bit, and that's because of recession worries, apparently.
Sure.
You know, there's an idea that OPEC is going to start to produce more. Biden just visited Saudi Arabia, and the conclusion is that they'll hopefully produce more. But I think that the way that it's trading right now is because people are thinking that we're going to go into a recession. People are going to use less oil. They're going to use less gasoline. So it's kind of that domino. Yeah,
that makes sense. And then I want to talk about home shortages specifically. I mean, that is one of the items where there's always this question about like, is this generation worse off than the previous generation? And housing is kind of the first thing that people point to. But I'm wondering what's like let's start with what your explanation is for the kind of decline in home ownership amongst the millennial Gen Z generation versus like the boomer generation.
Well, it's supply. Yeah. So like the boomers are still in the homes, and there's not more homes for people to buy. So I think that's a big problem. And I also think like there is, to your point about like maybe like lack of affordability, home prices are up like 50% over the past 2 years. Yeah. So people, millennials that are trying to move into suburbs, like, you know, get out of the city, have kids, whatever, that is not like, you can't work a 9 to 5 and afford a house anymore to a certain extent in some of these places. So I think that's part of the problem too. It's just affordability and supply. Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about your work kind of popularizing these a little bit more arcane economic concepts. So do you think about that when you're writing? Do you think about like, okay, there might be a technical term for something that's going on that I'm observing, but I kind of need to reframe this for a specific audience. So how do you think about like your creation process essentially?
Yeah, I mean, like there's different, like I create a lot of different content. So YouTube, newsletter, and TikTok all sort of like require, well, YouTube and the newsletter sort of thing, but like it all requires a different way of like approaching it. So for TikTok, it's like, how fast can I explain something? I only have 60 seconds to like explain relatively dense concepts. So it's really a combination of just explaining things in the simplest way possible, sort of repeating myself quite a bit and using visuals on screen to, if it is a little bit more complicated, to like help aid in that. So yeah, that's really the main thing, is like, how can I explain this in a way that like a 5-year-old would understand, even though 5-year-olds aren't watching my stuff, you know, it's just like, you have to make it as simple as possible. Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any other kind of economic concepts that you haven't quite cracked how to popularize? Man, I don't know. So like my most recent video was about the money supply not being the driver of inflation.
Ooh,
and
yeah,
that was like very controversial. And
very controversial.
I think that's like a very interesting one to kind of keep on pushing on, like these different schools of thoughts, like Keynes versus Friedman, like all those different things. Like, how do you sort of think about economic theory and then also economic practice? Because those are two very different things. So I think that's the biggest thing, is like people helping, and I need help with this too, but like there's nuance to this stuff. It's not always going to be one big thing driving everything. Like that is way too reductive.
How are you thinking about the downturn? I mean, it seems very technical at this perspective. Like it seems very like almost moderated by the Fed, and it seems like a voluntary recession, if anything. I mean, maybe you could make the argument that it's kind of like this delayed hangover payment for all of the previous crises that we've fought off with monetary policy, and now we're kind of paying that debt down. But how are you thinking about it? Are you thinking about it like, you know, this is 2008 or this is 2001 or this is, you know, are you looking to history or are you looking to something else?
Yeah, I mean, this is not 2008 in my mind. I think this time around, there's a lot more dominoes that are pretty concerning. So like what's going on in Europe is really worrying. So the ECB just raised their rates by 50 basis points, and Italy is about to implode essentially. In like Germany, their spreads are widening. So there's a lot of flashing red bells over in Europe, there's a lot of flashing bells in Japan, right? Like the yen is just cratering and they're hanging on to QE for dear life. And the Fed is sort of like the pillar of the rest of the central banks. And so what I'm really worried about is the Fed is going to have to go and kind of like save other central banks, and that will prevent them from fully executing on monetary policy here in the United States. I don't know if there's been another scenario kind of like that. Obviously, like Europe, and there's been little bailouts or help before, like the European debt crisis. So I think like it's happened, but yeah, this time around, there's just a lot of flashing red bells with debt. And I think that is, it's not like houses or consumers, it's like corporations and countries.
Yeah. When the pandemic hit, I looked back to, there's a great presentation by Sequoia Capital called like the Black Swan Memo, or RIP Good Times was the first version that they put out. And they put this out to all their portfolio companies at the start of the housing crash. And they looked at like a whole bunch of different economic factors, like the strength of the household balance sheet. And they basically told the story that like the average American consumer is way over leveraged. They're underwater on their mortgages. Like this is going to lead to a pretty severe recession. And they were right. A lot of people were saying this at the time. And then when COVID hit, I looked at all the same metrics, and the health of the American consumer was a lot stronger. It's a little bit weaker now, but in general, a lot of the fiscal stimulus, it seems like that actually shored up the average American's balance sheet. So the American consumer isn't in as much of a rough position, but we're in this very odd place where we have, solid employment numbers. We have inflation, but people have money. They're not entirely broke, but there's a lot of, different contagion risks all over the world in these like kind of niche pockets of financial assets where if it starts bleeding over, it could be really bad.
Yeah, no, I think it's like, it's definitely not as consumer driven this time around. Like consumers are doing relatively okay. Their credit card debt is ticking up, but it's not like 2008 where everybody had a mortgage, right? And it was not a mortgage that they should have been having. So I think it's definitely like this time around, like you're starting to see ghost companies. I think you're starting to see it, especially like in VC land, where there's these mega funded companies that are now having mass layoffs. And I think that is sort of a predecessor for public markets.
Yeah. It's always interesting to look at the size of these relative to like the size of the asset class relative to the amount of like press it gets, right?
Yeah.
Like crypto, massive press attention. But at the end of the day, it was like a $1 or $2 trillion market. And it sold off. And there were a couple like really, really bad blowups. But I was always, as the crypto run up was happening, I was always talking to my friends who were really into it, kind of trying to get a feel for the contagion effect if it didn't go well. Like, and when they broke down like, oh yeah, DeFi, it's great. You just like get this wallet and then go here and then go to Uniswap and do this. I was like, I'm not really worried about the average American grandmother getting wrapped up in that. Like maybe they bought some Bitcoin, but like, I don't think that they're, I don't think they're in Three Arrows Capital or, Luna or something. So it doesn't seem like that would have a major contagion effect. And it doesn't seem like it has, which is good. But obviously there are other asset classes that could have a much wider, contagion effect, like the government debt that you mentioned. It's just very interesting to look at these. Like, I don't think that there's very much attention paid to like, Japanese government debt in the American media versus like crypto.
Thanks for watching. I highly recommend following Kyla. Her content is super balanced and fast-paced, so you can quickly stay up to date with what's going on in the economy. I'll leave links to her accounts in the description below. Thanks for watching.